The cemetery was so quiet that morning that I could hear the sound of my own heartbeat. I could hear the creak of the folding chairs that had been set up beside the grave, the distant hum of a lawn mower somewhere across the rolling green hills of Meadowbrook Memorial Park, and the soft, suffocating sound of November wind moving through the bare oak trees that lined the perimeter of Richard's family plot. I stood there in my black wool coat, the long one he had bought me for our 20th anniversary in Paris, and I looked down at the casket that held the man I had loved for 34 years. The mahogany was polished to a mirror shine. The white lilies on top were already beginning to curl at the edges from the cold. The pastor had finished speaking 10 minutes ago, and the small gathering of friends and colleagues had offered their quiet condolences and drifted back to their cars with bowed heads and folded programs. And then there was just me, and the grave, and the sound of the wind. It was 11:14 in the morning when I placed the last rose, a deep dark red, almost burgundy, the color Richard had always brought me on Valentine's Day, because he said lighter reds looked cheap, against the side of the casket. I smoothed the stem with my thumb and forefinger, the way I used to smooth the lapel of his suit jacket before he went into an important meeting. A habit, a reflex, the kind of thing your hands do when your brain has gone somewhere far away and left your body to manage on its own. I heard the car doors before I heard the voices. Two solid, expensive thuds from the parking lot about 40 yards behind me, across the gravel path, and through a stand of evergreen shrubs. Then the voices started, low at first, almost murmuring, the way you speak in a place where the dead are resting. But by the time 4 minutes had passed, the voices were no longer low. The Winnetka house is worth at least 3.2, Brandon. I had it appraised last spring. You had it appraised? What do you mean you had it appraised? I mean, I called a realtor and I had it appraised. Someone needed to be practical. Dad wasn't even dead yet, Ashley. Dad had been dying for 2 years, Brandon. Don't act like this is a surprise. I stood very still. The wind moved through the oaks above me and carried their voices clearly across the cold air, the way sound travels differently in winter, stripped of leaves and warmth, nothing left to soften it or absorb it. I did not turn around. I kept my eyes on the mahogany casket and the dark red rose and the white lilies going brown at their edges, and I listened. What about the Lake Geneva place? That's what I'm saying. Between Winnetka, Lake Geneva, the downtown condo, and the portfolio, we're looking at somewhere between 11 and 14 million in liquid and real estate. Maybe more if the market holds. And the business interests? I already talked to Gerald at Hartwell and Associates. He said the stake in the Meridian Group alone could be worth. You talked to Gerald, Dad's attorney? You called Dad's attorney before we even buried him? There was a pause. I heard the crunch of gravel under a shoe, the lighter click of a car door being leaned against. Someone had to, Brandon. Someone had to be the adult here. I reached into the left pocket of my black wool coat. My fingers found the edge of the envelope immediately, the way they had found it every morning for the past week, reaching in without thinking, just to confirm it was still there. The paper was thick, cream colored, the kind of paper that Richard's attorney Marcus Webb had used for 30 years, the kind of paper that meant something, the kind of paper that held weight. I left it in my pocket. I kept arranging the flowers, and I took a very deep breath. If you've ever stood at the grave of someone you loved with everything you had, while listening to your own children divide his estate in the parking lot 40 yards away, then you already know what that breath felt like. And if you haven't, if that particular kind of grief is still mercifully foreign to you, then I need you to stay with me. Because what happened next is something I have been waiting to tell someone for a very long time, and I want to make sure you understand all of it. Every piece, every year that built to that morning, every silent sacrifice and quiet betrayal and small devastating choice that led me to that cemetery, to that grave, to that envelope in my pocket. Before I tell you what was in that envelope, I need to tell you who Richard was, and who I was, and who our children became, and why, and how. A family that once sat around a Thanksgiving table laughing until the gravy went cold turned into something that looked like that parking lot scene on a gray November morning. But before I do any of that, if this story is already getting under your skin the way I think it is, do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to this channel because what I'm about to tell you is going to take a while and it's going to go places you're not expecting. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever been betrayed by someone you raised? Because I'm going to need to know I'm not alone in this. And then settle in because we're going back to the beginning. My name is Lucy Hargrove. I was born Lucy Ann Callahan in Evanston, Illinois in 1971, the second of three daughters of a high school chemistry teacher named Daniel Callahan and a woman named Margaret who made the best beef stew in the greater Chicago area and could stretch a dollar until it screamed. We were not poor, not exactly, but we were careful. We were the family that took vacations in the car, driving to Wisconsin or Michigan, sleeping in motels that had small pools and vending machines in the hallway. We were the family where the Christmas presents were wrapped in the paper from the previous year, ironed flat, and refolded and stored in the basement closet. My father wore the same wool overcoat for 19 years. My mother repaired the soles of shoes rather than replace them. We were not unhappy. I want to make that clear. We were not unhappy at all. We just understood, in the cellular, unspoken way that children absorb the truths of their households, that things had to be taken care of. I was practical from the beginning. My older sister Donna was the dreamer. She went to art school in New York and spent 20 years painting and waitressing and eventually married a musician and seemed genuinely content with the texture of that life. My younger sister Carol was the social one, popular and effortlessly charming, the one who always had a circle of friends and knew exactly what to say in every situation. I was the one who kept the family calendar, who remembered which teacher was strict about late assignments, who made sure the car got its oil change on schedule. I was not dull. I want to say that too. I had a sense of humor and I liked music and I read novels late into the night. But I was organized and methodical in a way that felt less like a personality trait and more like a calling. I went to Northwestern on a partial academic scholarship, studying business administration, and it was there, in the fall semester of my junior year, at a fundraising dinner for the university's arts endowment. My roommate had dragged me there under significant protest, that I met Richard Hargrove. He was 27 years old. He was wearing a dark blue blazer that was just slightly too large in the shoulders, the kind of fit that suggested it had been borrowed or recently inherited rather than bought. And he was standing near the far end of the appetizer table, looking distinctly uncomfortable with the whole enterprise. He had dark hair that fell across his forehead and brown eyes that were warm and watchful, and a little tired in the way that very intelligent people's eyes sometimes are, like they spend so much time processing the world that by evening they've earned a certain weariness. He was talking to no one. He was eating a small square of bruschetta with tremendous concentration. The room around him was all polished surfaces and practiced laughter. The particular social performance of people who attend fundraising dinners regularly enough that the performance has become a reflex. Women in cocktail dresses, men in suits that fit correctly because they had been measured for them. The kind of room where everyone seemed to know the choreography except the two of us. Me in a dress I had bought at a thrift store and altered myself. Him in the borrowed blazer, both of us stranded at the edges of an event that felt designed for a species we were not quite members of. I walked over because I recognized a fellow person who did not want to be there. The bruschetta is the best thing on the table, I said. The salmon crostini are overworked. He looked up at me with an expression that moved quickly from surprise to amusement. How do you know the salmon is overworked? I've been watching people take one bite and set the rest down for the past 20 minutes. He looked across the room, studying the evidence trail I was describing, and then looked back at me with something that I can only describe as recognition, as if I had said something in a language he hadn't expected to hear at that particular party. I'm Richard, he said. I'm Lucy. Do you want to go find somewhere quieter? I've seen enough of this. I was just thinking the same thing. We left the fundraiser and walked to a diner 3 blocks from campus and sat in a corner booth for 4 hours drinking coffee and talking. He told me he was a year out of University of Chicago's business school, working for a mid-sized private equity firm downtown, already restless, already feeling the early stirrings of the need to build something of his own. I told him about my degree, about my father's practicality and my mother's economy, and the way those things had shaped me. He told me about his own parents, his father Harold, who had built a successful commercial real estate business from nothing, and who was, by Richard's account, both admirable and utterly exhausting, and his mother Evelyn, who was elegant and reserved and profoundly difficult to read. He had one sibling, a brother named Thomas, who lived in Seattle, and whom Richard described with a complicated expression that I later learned to decode as love tangled with old rivalry. On our third date at a small Italian restaurant near Wrigley Field, he told me he was going to start his own investment firm within 3 years. He said it without boasting, without inflation, the way you state a fact you have already made peace with. I believed him completely, not because I was naive or infatuated, though I was certainly the latter, but because I had already learned to read the specific gravity of Richard Hargrove's certainty. When he was uncertain about something, you could see it in the slight tension at the corner of his jaw, the way he rolled a pen between his fingers. When he was certain, he went very still, and his voice dropped a register, and he looked you directly in the eye without blinking. He was very still that night. We were married 3 years later, in June of 1995, at a small ceremony at my parents' house in Evanston. 42 guests, my mother's garden, a tent in case of rain that we ultimately didn't need. I wore a dress I had found at a vintage shop on Armitage Avenue and had altered by a seamstress on the north side. Richard wore the suit he had bought for his first client presentation, which fit him perfectly by then because he had finally stopped borrowing clothes. My father walked me down the makeshift aisle between the folding chairs and squeezed my hand at the end and said very quietly, so only I could hear, "This one's worth it, Lucy. Take care of each other." We took care of each other. For a long time, we did. Richard founded Hargrove Capital Partners in 1997, 2 years after we married, almost exactly on the timeline he had predicted. He started with 4 employees, including himself, in a 2 room office in the West Loop, and I handled all the administrative infrastructure in those first 18 months while continuing my own job as a financial analyst at a consulting firm downtown. I was the one who set up the accounting systems, negotiated the office lease, managed the early vendor relationships, kept the operational side of things from falling apart, while Richard focused entirely on building the client base and developing the investment strategies that would eventually make the firm's reputation. I was not a silent partner. I was not a supportive wife standing in the background holding a tray of sandwiches. I was working beside him, 14-hour days, most weekends, my own career running parallel to his. Our finances combined and directed entirely toward making Hargrove Capital viable in those first critical years. Brandon was born in 1998, when the firm was 18 months old and still running on ambition and coffee and a line of credit we both tried not to think about too carefully. I took 6 weeks off after he was born and then went back to work because we needed both incomes, and I am not ashamed of that. I am proud of it. I was 38 hours in labor with Brandon, and I was back at my desk reviewing quarterly projections 42 days later, and I loved my son fiercely and completely while doing both those things. Ashley came along in 2001, easier labor but more complicated temperament from the very beginning, and by then the firm had turned its first significant profit, and we had bought the house in Winnetka, a large colonial on a quiet street 2 blocks from the lake, with a yard big enough for a swing set and a garden, and a golden retriever named Chester, who would eventually become the emotional center of our family for 14 years. The years between 2001 and 2010 were, by almost every external measure, excellent years. Richard's firm grew steadily, then rapidly, acquiring the kind of reputation in the Chicago financial community that generates its own momentum. By 2005, we had moved into the downtown office space in the Aeon Center that would become the firm's permanent home. By 2007, the portfolio under management had crossed $200 million. By 2010, after navigating the financial crisis with unusual skill and a conservatism that Richard had been criticized for in the boom years and praised for afterward, the number was closer to 400 million. We bought the Lake Geneva house in 2006, a sprawling cedar and glass structure on the Wisconsin side of the lake with a private dock and a boathouse and 6 bedrooms. We bought the downtown condo in 2008, partly as a tax strategy and partly because Richard was spending so many late nights at the office that having a place in the city made practical sense. I quit my job at the consulting firm in 2007 to devote myself full time to the management of our household and investments, and to begin what would become a meaningful secondary career in nonprofit work, eventually joining the boards of 2 Chicago arts organizations and a children's literacy foundation that I cared about deeply. We traveled every year: Italy, France, Japan, Argentina, South Africa. We took the children when they were old enough to appreciate it. Brandon's first international trip was at age 8, a week in London that he still talks about, or used to talk about. Ashley was 7 when we first took her to Paris, and she stood in front of a painting at the Musée d'Orsay for so long that a security guard came to ask if she was all right. I am telling you all of this not to impress you, not to catalogue our assets or display the life we built. I am telling you because I need you to understand what it felt like from the inside. Because from the inside, it was not an abstract success story. It was 1,000 Tuesday mornings making lunches. It was Richard and I sitting at the kitchen table at 11 at night, reviewing the week's decisions over glasses of wine and the leftover pasta I had reheated on the stove. It was dragging Christmas trees through the Winnetka snow while the children argued about who got to put the star on top. It was 34 years of ordinary, extraordinary life, the kind that looks different from every angle depending on what you're looking for. And it was me. Running the household, managing the philanthropy, raising 2 children, supporting a husband who was building something genuinely significant, being present and capable and reliable, and all of the things that don't show up on a balance sheet, but without which no balance sheet in the world would have been possible. I want you to remember that part because my children forgot it. The first time I noticed something shift in Brandon, he was 26 years old and had just joined the firm. Richard had offered him a junior analyst position, which was generous but not unreasonable. Brandon had an MBA from Booth and was genuinely intelligent about markets, though he lacked what I privately thought of as Richard's instinct, that particular quality of judgment that goes beyond analysis into something almost intuitive. Brandon was good at the work technically, but he was also immediately interested in things that were adjacent to the work: the social architecture of the firm, the client relationships, the question of who deferred to whom in which rooms. He noticed power the way some people notice weather, constantly, reflexively, with an awareness that seemed to supersede whatever else was happening. He moved into a condo in Lincoln Park and began spending money in a way that concerned me quietly from the beginning. Not recklessly, Brandon was too controlled for recklessness, but aspirationally. He bought clothes that were slightly beyond his salary. He went to restaurants that required reservations made 3 weeks in advance. He joined a private club on the Gold Coast whose annual dues were more than my father had earned in a teaching year. When I asked him about it once gently, he said, "Mom, I need to be seen in the right places. It's how this business works." I did not say what I was thinking, which was, it is how this business works when you are the founder, not when you are a junior analyst whose last name happens to be on the door. Ashley's trajectory was different, but the destination I eventually understood was the same. She had been artistic as a child. That long stand in front of the Musée d'Orsay had not been an anomaly, and she went to art school in Chicago, then spent 2 years in New York doing something vague that involved gallery events and editorial work and a rotating cast of interesting looking friends whose Instagram accounts were full of moody lighting and expensive coffee. She came back to Chicago at 24 with what she described as a more refined vision for her work, and she and Richard had a series of conversations in his study that I was not part of. And what emerged from those conversations was a significant financial arrangement, a studio space in the West Loop, living expenses covered for 2 years, and the understanding that if Ashley's artistic career did not generate sufficient income by the end of those 2 years, she would pivot to something more commercially viable. The 2 years became four. The four became something unspoken and apparently permanent. Ashley's work was genuinely good. I believed that, and I believe it still. But the studio and the lifestyle and the quiet, ongoing supplement from Richard's account had become, I slowly understood, not a launch pad, but a foundation. Something she stood on rather than something she was building from. I raised these concerns with Richard privately, as I raised most things that involved our children, because I had learned over the years that he was more receptive to careful conversation than to direct confrontation, and because I loved him enough to work within the ways he was made rather than constantly pushing against them. He listened. He nodded. He said the words that I had heard him say on this subject before. "They'll find their footing, Lucy. They need time." "Brandon has been a junior analyst for 4 years," I said. "He's growing. He's watching. There's a difference." Richard was quiet for a moment. We were sitting in the study, the room I liked best in the Vinetka house, with its floor to ceiling bookshelves and the fireplace that worked, and the two leather chairs angled toward each other that we had bought at an estate sale in Lake Forest the year Brandon was born. Outside the windows, the November garden was going dark and bare. "I see it too," Richard said finally. "I just don't know what to do about it yet." That was 2019. Richard was 62. He had been having the occasional headache for about 6 months, which he attributed to stress and screen time and the general indignity of aging. In January of 2020, the headaches intensified, and he had an MRI because I insisted, and the MRI showed what his neurologist called a low grade glioma, a brain tumor, slow growing, the doctor said, with a measured optimism that I had to work to believe, in the left temporal lobe. The world changed after that. Or rather, the private world of our family changed after that, the way the world always changes when mortality moves from abstract to specific, from the general fact that all things end to the particular, undeniable truth of this man, this life, this clock. Richard told Brandon and Ashley the diagnosis at dinner in Vinetka in February of 2020, the week before the pandemic shut everything down, and the world's collective experience of uncertainty multiplied by some incalculable factor. They both cried. I believed the tears were genuine. I believe that still. Whatever happened later, whatever choices were made, I do not think my children were without love for their father. I think love and greed are not mutually exclusive. And I think that is one of the most painful things it is possible to understand about human nature. The treatments began in March and continued through the year. Richard was strong. He had always been physically strong, the kind of person whose body cooperated with whatever demands his mind made of it. And he worked through most of the treatment period, adapting the firm to his new energy constraints with the same strategic clarity he brought to everything. Mara Johansson, his deputy for the past 8 years, carried more of the operational weight. The clients were managed carefully. The story told with Richard's explicit direction was one of health challenges being navigated competently, which was true enough for long enough that it held. But I knew, because I was there every day, that the slow growing tumor was growing. The headaches changed quality over time. Less pressure, more a kind of disorientation, a flickering at the edges of his vision that came and went. He was tired in a way he had never been tired before, a bone level exhaustion that rest did not fully relieve. We had good stretches. There were months where the treatment seemed to be holding things stable, where we walked the Lake Geneva shoreline in the evenings and talked about the firm's 5 year plan and what we might do after. Places we still wanted to see, projects that felt unfinished. He wanted to teach eventually. He had always wanted to teach. He had imagined a visiting lecturer appointment at Booth or Northwestern, somewhere he could take the specific knowledge accumulated over 30 years and put it into young hands. I watched him want that, and I willed it to be possible. It was not possible. By the fall of 2022, the tumor had progressed beyond what the treatments could contain. His neurologist, a careful and kind man named Dr. Patel, who had been with us from the beginning, sat with us in his office and used the particular vocabulary of medicine when it has reached the limits of what medicine can do. We were looking, he said, at a time frame. Not certain, never fully certain, but probable. Months rather than years. We drove home from that appointment in silence. Not the uncomfortable silence of people who don't know what to say to each other, but the deep silence of people who know each other so completely that words are not yet the right instrument for what is being felt. I drove because Richard had surrendered the car to me gradually over the past several months as his vision became less reliable. The November trees along the Eden's Expressway were stripped and skeletal in the grey afternoon light. At home, I made tea, and we sat in the study in the two leather chairs, and Richard said, "I need to talk to you about the children." I said, "I know." "They're not ready," he said. I looked at him. He was looking at the fire, his hands around his mug, his profile still sharp and familiar and completely his own, despite everything the tumor had taken from the edges. "No," I said. "They're not." What followed over the next several weeks was a series of conversations that I will not fully detail here, because some of them were private in a way I want to protect even now. But I will tell you the substance, because the substance is the architecture of everything that happened in that cemetery parking lot. Richard had built over 34 years of disciplined work and careful investment, an estate that his attorney, Marcus Webb, estimated at approximately $14 million, inclusive of real estate, the firm partnership stake, liquid investments, and various other assets. The firm itself was in the process of a structured succession plan that had been in development for several years, and Richard's stake in it under the terms of that plan would be acquired by the remaining partners over a 5 year period, generating a revenue stream rather than a lump sum payment. This was deliberate. Richard had thought about this carefully, the way he thought about everything. He had watched what happened to families when large amounts of money arrived at once, without structure, without the friction that builds character. He had watched it happen to clients' families and to families he knew personally, and he had thought, with the specific acuity of a man who now knew his time was measured, about what he wanted for his own. He was worried about Brandon. He said this to me directly, and I felt the weight of it, the way you feel the weight of a truth you have been carrying alone and finally get to set down. Brandon had been at the firm for 6 years at that point and had risen to a senior analyst position, but had not been made a partner. And Richard believed, correctly, I thought, that this absence of partnership status was interpreted by Brandon as a temporary oversight rather than a considered judgment. Brandon had come to believe, Richard said, that the firm was his birthright, and birthright thinking, in Richard's experience, was one of the most dangerous cognitive traps a person could fall into because it replaced the work of earning with the posture of deserving. He was worried about Ashley too, though differently. Ashley's dependency on financial support from her parents had become, Richard feared, structural rather than temporary. She had built a life premised on a floor that Richard provided, and without that floor, without the time to build her own, she would not fall softly. I don't want to leave them nothing, he said. I want to leave them something worth having, but I don't want to leave them an amount that removes the necessity of becoming who they need to become. He had specific plans, trusts structured with disbursement conditions. The Lake Geneva house placed in a family trust with usage rights but no immediate sale authority. A portion of the liquid assets designated for Brandon and Ashley under terms that required matching contributions from their own earned income. A structure designed to reward work rather than simply transfer wealth. The Winnetka house and the downtown condo, Richard wanted to remain in my name outright. The firm revenue stream under the succession agreement would flow to me directly. All of this was legal, was documented, had been worked through with Marcus Webb across multiple sessions over the preceding year. Richard was lucid through this entire process. The tumor had taken things from him, but it had not taken his mind, not the essential quality of it. And the decisions he made in those months were the decisions of someone who understood exactly what he was deciding and why. What Richard also did, in consultation with Marcus Webb and without telling Brandon or Ashley, was execute a durable power of attorney that gave me complete and sole authority over all decisions related to the estate, the assets, and any legal proceedings arising from the administration of the will or trust documents in the event of his death or incapacity. This document was signed and notarized and witnessed appropriately. It was executed on the 14th of November 2023. Richard Hargrove died on the 15th. I was with him. It was early morning, just before 6. The sky outside the window of the Winnetka bedroom still fully dark. His breathing had changed in the night, and I had woken and taken his hand, and I sat with him while the change completed itself. And when it was over, I sat a while longer, just holding his hand in the dark, not ready yet for all the things that were going to start happening once I let the morning in. Brandon and Ashley had been in the house for the final week. They had taken rooms upstairs and had been present for the meals and the quiet evenings and the last days when their father had been mostly asleep, but occasionally surfacing into brief, clear wakefulness where he knew exactly where he was and who was with him and what he wanted to say. He had said things to each of them privately. I don't know what those things were. I hope they were good things. I believe they were. I called them downstairs after I had sat long enough to feel ready. I made the calls that needed to be made. Dr. Patel, the funeral home, Marcus Webb. Brandon made coffee. Ashley sat at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug and said nothing for a very long time. We were each in our own grief, and we were also together in it. And for that one morning, I felt that we were the family I had always believed we were, and had sometimes in the preceding years allowed myself to doubt. The doubt returned within 48 hours. It started small. Brandon asking very casually whether Richard had made any changes to the estate documents in the past year. Me saying evenly that Marcus Webb would be in touch with the relevant information in due course, as was standard practice. Brandon pressing slightly. Had I spoken with Marcus? Did I have any sense of the timeline? Was there anything he should know? I looked at my son across the kitchen counter of the house where he had grown up, where I had made his lunches for 12 years and stayed up watching the clock. On the nights he was late coming home from wherever teenagers went in the early 2000s, and I said, "Let's let Marcus handle the process, Brandon. We just buried your father yesterday." He had the grace to look slightly ashamed. "Of course, I'm sorry. It's just a lot to process." "I know," I said, "for all of us." Ashley's version was quieter and more strategic. She waited until we were alone. Brandon had gone out for a run on the third morning, which I noted because grieving people don't usually feel like running. And she sat across from me at the breakfast table and said, in the soft voice she used when she wanted something and knew she had to approach it carefully, "Mom, I just want you to know that I trust you completely. Whatever Dad wanted, I support it. I just, I'm in a really vulnerable position right now, financially, and I wanted you to know that I'm going to need some support through this transition." I poured cream into my coffee and stirred it. "What kind of support?" "Just continued support. What Dad had been providing, until I can stabilize things." "What things need stabilizing?" A pause. "The studio lease comes up in February, and I have some outstanding commitments." "What kind of commitments?" Another pause, longer. "Some expenses that came up. I've been meaning to talk to Dad about them, but with everything." "How much, Ashley?" She told me. It was not a small number. It was the kind of number that explained suddenly and completely why her financial situation had apparently become acute enough to require a careful conversation 3 days after her father's death. I set down my coffee cup. I looked at my daughter, who was beautiful and talented, and had been, when she stood in front of that painting in Paris at age 7, one of the most genuinely feeling people I had ever seen. And I said, "Let's talk to Marcus together. That's the right process." She nodded. Her jaw was tight. The soft voice was put away. The funeral was on a Thursday, 10 days after Richard's death. 180 people came, which was a true reflection of the life he had built. Colleagues, clients, old friends from Northwestern and the University of Chicago, neighbors from Winnetka, people from the nonprofit world I had worked in, people I didn't recognize who had to introduce themselves, and who told me stories about encounters with Richard that I had never heard and that made me love him fresh with each telling. His brother Thomas flew in from Seattle with his wife, and they were kind and steady, and Thomas cried at the graveside in a way that was ungainly and completely unguarded. The crying of a man who has decided dignity is not the point, and I was grateful for it. After the service, after the burial, after the pastor had spoken and the last prayer had been said, and the last person who wasn't family had offered condolences and walked away through the grey November morning toward the parking lot, I was left at the grave. I arranged the flowers the way I have always arranged flowers, methodically, paying attention to color and proportion, making something beautiful out of what was given to work with. I heard the car doors close behind me. I heard Brandon's voice, then Ashley's, carrying across the cold, still air. "The Winnetka house is worth at least 3.2, Brandon. I had it appraised last spring." I heard it all. I have told you what I heard. I stood at the grave of my husband and I heard my children in the parking lot, 40 yards away, on the day of his burial, dividing his life into properties and portfolios with the brisk efficiency of people who had been waiting a long time to have this conversation. I heard Brandon say, "What about the trusts? Did you find out anything about the trusts?" I heard Ashley say, "Gerald said the way Dad structured it, there are conditions, but conditions can be contested. He said if we moved together, presented a unified position, she's going to fight us. She doesn't have the legal resources we have. We control, We don't control anything yet. We will. Gerald says with the right filing, we can challenge the trust conditions on grounds of undue influence. He said, with the right documentation. Undue influence? That's insane, Ashley. That's It's a legal strategy, Brandon. It's not personal. I stopped arranging the flowers. I stood very still, looking at the mahogany casket and the white lilies and the dark red rose I had placed against the wood. And I thought of Richard in his study, with his hands around a mug and the fire burning, and his voice saying, I need to talk to you about the children. I thought of Marcus Webb's office, the two of them, three of them, with me, sitting around the conference table working through documents that had been prepared with the kind of care that only comes from truly understanding what you're trying to protect. I thought of the 14th of November, the day before Richard died, when Marcus had come to the house with a notary and two witnesses, and Richard had signed the durable power of attorney with a hand that was less steady than it used to be, but a mind that was completely, entirely his own. I put my hand in my pocket. My fingers found the envelope. I took it out. I turned around. Brandon and Ashley were standing beside Brandon's BMW, about 30 feet from the gravel path. Ashley with her phone in her hand, and Brandon with his arms crossed, and both of them with the slightly guilty, slightly defiant expression of people who have been caught doing something they knew was wrong but had decided was necessary. They saw me turn. They saw the envelope in my hand. There was a long moment of quiet. Mom, Brandon started. Come here, I said. My voice was even. It surprised me how even it was. I had expected to feel the enormous weight of grief and anger pressing into my throat and making the words difficult. Instead, I felt something else, a clarity, a groundedness, the particular steadiness that comes not from the absence of feeling, but from the presence of purpose. They walked toward me. The gravel crunched under their shoes. The November wind moved through the oaks. I held out the envelope. Your father's attorney prepared this document on November 14th, I said. He signed it in the presence of a notary and two witnesses. It is a durable power of attorney, granting me complete and sole authority over all assets, all properties, all estate proceedings, and all decisions arising from the administration of his will and trusts. I let them look at it for a moment. I have spoken with Marcus Webb. I have spoken with our estate attorneys at Harrington and Bell, who have been engaged for the past 6 months. I am aware of your conversation with Gerald Hartley at Hartwell and Associates. I paused. Gerald Hartley is a fine attorney for certain kinds of work. He is not the right attorney for the kind of work you are contemplating. And the conversation you just had, which I heard from this grave, will be noted. Ashley's face had gone a particular color that I recognized from her childhood, the flush that came not from embarrassment, but from the specific humiliation of being outmaneuvered. Brandon said, Mom, we weren't. You were, I said gently. You were. And I want you to understand that I am not angry. Or rather, I am. I am angry in the way that you are angry when someone you love chooses a path you watched them choosing and tried to intervene in and could not, in the end, redirect. But the anger is the smaller feeling. The larger feeling is grief, and not just for your father, for what I thought we were, and for what I can now see clearly we are, for the children I raised, and for the adults you became. Neither of them said anything. Your father knew, I said. He knew. He was not naive, and he was not fooled, and he was not, as I know you are planning to argue, unduly influenced by anyone. He made his decisions with full clarity and full love and a specific, considered understanding of what he wanted his death to accomplish for the people he was leaving behind. I held the envelope and looked at them across the grave of the man we all loved. He wanted to give you a chance to become who you need to become. That was the gift, not the money, the chance. The conditions in those trusts are not punishments, they are invitations. I looked at Brandon. You are not going to inherit the firm, Brandon. You are going to have to earn a position in it. The same way every person who has ever worked there has earned their position. Your father believed you could do that. I believe you can do that, but you will have to choose it. I looked at Ashley. The studio lease and the expenses and whatever else is outstanding. We will work through that together, properly, through Marcus. But the flow your father provided is not available in the same form going forward. What is available is a structure designed to support work that you are actually doing. I hope you choose to use it. The silence that followed was very long. Somewhere across the cemetery, a bird was calling. A crow, maybe, or a jay, something with a sharp, carrying voice. The oaks moved in the wind. The white lilies on the casket had gone fully brown at their edges now. Their usefulness as beauty ended, their purpose as offering still intact. Brandon uncrossed his arms. His face had undergone a visible internal process that I watched and recognized and hoped was genuine. I'm sorry, Mom, he said. And then, more quietly, I'm sorry to Dad. Ashley said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, I didn't think you knew. I knew most of it, I said. Your father knew more. We stood together at the grave for another few minutes. It was not warm. Nothing had been resolved in the sense of being finished. There would be months of legal process ahead, meetings with Marcus, difficult conversations, adjustments that would not all go smoothly. Brandon would eventually have a conversation with Mara Johansson that would begin the genuine work of earning his place at the firm. A conversation that took more courage than I had expected from him and that revised my estimate of him upward. Ashley would, after considerable resistance, let go of the studio lease and spend 6 months doing something she had not done in years, working for an hourly wage at a design studio in Wicker Park, learning the texture of earning, and discovering in the process that she was better at the work and more fulfilled by it than she had understood. Neither of these things was easy. Neither of them happened quickly. And I am not going to tell you that we became the family of easy Sunday dinners and uncomplicated love that I had once imagined we might be. But I am going to tell you what the next 2 years look like, because that is the part that matters. I moved into the Vinetka house permanently. I let the downtown condo on a long lease that generates income I use for the foundation work I care about. The Lake Geneva house is still in the family trust, and we use it in the summers. All of us, together, with the complicated and imperfect love of people who have been honest with each other and are trying to build something real out of what's left. Last summer, Ashley brought a man she's been seeing, a structural engineer from Evanston named Paul, who builds things with his hands and has a very direct way of speaking, and who looked at the lake for the first 10 minutes after arriving as if he had never seen anything so beautiful. Brandon came with his girlfriend and spent 2 days working remotely from the dock, and 2 evenings having the kind of real conversations with me that we had not had in years. Conversations about what he actually wants, about the difference between the life he had been performing and the life he is trying to choose. Gerald Hartley's strategy of contesting the trust on grounds of undue influence was filed and dismissed. The judge, a woman with the particular patience of someone who has seen every variety of family dispute a courtroom can contain, read the documentation Marcus provided and declined to proceed. Gerald sent a bill for his services that I understand Brandon and Ashley divided between them, which struck me as fitting. The firm is doing well. Mara Johansson was named managing partner in accordance with the succession agreement. Brandon is a partner now, a junior partner, earned over 18 months of work that impressed people who had every reason to be skeptical and no obligation to be generous. He told me at Thanksgiving last year that he understood now what his father had been trying to give him. He didn't want to give me the thing, he said. He wanted to give me the experience of getting it. I told him that was exactly right. I think about Richard every day, not always with grief, sometimes with something closer to gratitude or admiration or the particular warmth of knowing someone completely and being known by them in return. A warmth that does not go cold just because one of the two people is gone. He was methodical and he was careful, and he was, in the end, exactly right about what he saw and exactly right about what was needed. He prepared not for the betrayal, but for the possibility of it, with enough love to leave a door open and enough wisdom to make sure the door required effort to walk through. He signed that power of attorney the day before he died. I do not know if he knew it was the day before. I know he knew it was necessary. I know he looked at Marcus Webb across the conference table and then looked at me and said, with the quietness of a man who has made peace with what he knows, "This protects her. And it protects them, too, from themselves mostly." Marcus nodded. The notary prepared her stamp. The witnesses signed. I folded the document into the cream colored envelope that had been sitting in my coat pocket for 10 days, and I carried it with me through every minute of the grief and the preparation and the morning of the funeral, and I set it on the grave at 11 when I said goodbye to Richard, and I took it back at noon when my children needed to hear what their father had prepared. He prepared it because he loved them. He protected me because he loved me. And I stood at that grave and made sure his wishes were honored because that is what you do when someone has trusted you with the weight of their life's work and the care of their heart's people. You carry it. You carry it as far as it needs to go. If you have made it to the end of this story, I want to say something to you directly, the way I have been talking to you since the beginning, because this is not just my story. I know it's not. I know there are people watching this who have stood at similar graves with similar envelopes, or who have been in those parking lots on the wrong side of this, or who are somewhere in the middle of a version of this right now, watching the people you love make choices that break your heart. Richard used to say, and I find myself repeating it more often now, in the years since he died, that the only inheritance worth leaving is the kind that requires something of the person who receives it, not the money, not the property, the invitation to become someone worthy of it. I am Lucy Hargrove. I am 64 years old. I live in Winnetka, Illinois, in the house where I raised my children and where I sat for 34 years in a leather chair across from the man I loved, talking about all the things worth talking about. I tend the garden that my mother never saw but would have approved of. I am on the board of a literacy foundation that, last year, put books into the hands of 11,000 children who might not otherwise have had them. And every year in November, on the anniversary of the 14th, I bring a dark red rose to Meadowbrook Memorial Park and I place it against the stone. And I stand there for a while in the quiet, and I feel, underneath the grief and the gratitude and the particular bittersweet weight of a life fully lived, something that I can only call peace. He knew. He planned. He loved us with his eyes open. That was Richard Hargrove. That was my husband. If this story moved you, if you felt even a fraction of what it felt like to live it, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel because I have more stories, and every one of them is true, and every one of them is about the one thing that matters most: what we build and who we trust to carry it forward, and whether love, in the end, is enough to hold the whole weight of it. Leave me a comment. Tell me about your Richard. Tell me about your parking lot. Tell me about the envelope in your pocket and what was in it and whether it changed everything the way mine changed mine. I'll read every one, I promise. There is something I want to add because some of you have already left comments. I can feel the questions forming even as I tell this story, asking about what happened with the legal challenge. You want the details. You want to know what it looked like when Brandon and Ashley walked into Marcus Webb's office and realized the full scope of what their father had prepared. Let me tell you. The meeting at Harrington and Bell was scheduled for 10 days after the funeral. Richard had wanted it that way, a period of grief before the machinery of legal process, a breathing space that Marcus had built into the timeline deliberately. When we arrived, Brandon and Ashley had Gerald Hartley with them, which I had expected. Gerald is a capable attorney in mergers and acquisitions work and handles private client matters for a number of Chicago families I know. He is not, as I had noted at the grave, the right attorney for this kind of work. He knows it too, which is why his expression in that conference room was the particular expression of a man who has taken on a case that he has privately assessed as significantly weaker than his clients believe. Marcus Webb has been practicing estate law in Chicago for 40 years. He is 71 years old, bald, compact, and precise in the way of people who have spent decades in rooms where imprecision costs money and sometimes costs families. He has a particular gift for the kind of patience that is not passive. It is active, strategic patience, the patience of someone who has the documents and knows he has the documents and is willing to wait exactly as long as necessary for everyone else in the room to understand this. He laid out the estate structure in full: the trusts, the conditions, the succession agreement, the power of attorney. He did it without drama, reading the relevant sections aloud in his measured Midwestern voice, pausing to ask if there were questions after each document. When he was done, he folded his hands on the table and looked at Gerald Hartley with the specific courtesy of a senior colleague who wants to give someone the opportunity to gracefully revise their position. Gerald said, "We want to note the question of undue influence regarding the trust conditions." Marcus said, "Of course." He opened another folder. "I have here the documentation of 12 separate meetings over the course of 14 months in which the trust structure was discussed and revised. I have the notes from 8 of those meetings, prepared by myself and by my paralegal. I have the affidavit of Dr. Anand Patel, Mr. Hargrove's neurologist, attesting to the quality and consistency of his cognitive function throughout the estate planning process, including on the date of the power of attorney execution. I have the statement of the two witnesses and the notary present at that execution. And I have a letter prepared by Richard Hargrove himself, handwritten, addressed to any court that might be asked to consider the question of his intentions." He paused. "Would you like me to read that letter aloud?" Gerald looked at Brandon. Brandon looked at Ashley. Ashley looked at the table. "Yes," Brandon said quietly. "Please." Marcus read the letter. I will not reproduce it here in full because it was addressed to a court and not to an audience, and because some of Richard's words in it were about me in a way that I want to keep in the private space where they belong. But I will tell you that it was direct and specific and entirely unmistakably Richard. The precise language, the careful logic, the bone deep sincerity that ran under everything he ever said and wrote. He explained his reasoning. He described his children with love and with honesty. He said that he did not want to be remembered as someone who gave his children less than they deserved, but that he believed what they deserved was the chance to earn something and the structure that would make earning possible. He said that his wife Lucy had been his partner in every meaningful sense of that word for 34 years, and that his decision to grant her sole authority over the estate was not a transaction, but a tribute. When Marcus finished reading, the conference room was quiet for a long time. Brandon's hands were flat on the table. Ashley had her head slightly bowed. Gerald Hartley closed his notepad. He looked at his clients and then at Marcus and then at me. "I think," he said carefully, "that we should have a brief recess." The challenge was withdrawn. Gerald sent his bill. The process moved forward the way Richard had designed it to move forward, and each step of it, however difficult in the moment, had the particular quality of things that have been correctly designed. They fit, they held, they led somewhere real. I am telling you this because I think it matters to know that preparation is not pessimism. Richard did not prepare for betrayal because he expected his children to be bad people. He prepared for it because he understood human nature with the clarity that comes from watching it for a long time, and because he loved his family enough to do the hard work of thinking carefully about what they actually needed rather than what they thought they wanted. The envelope in my pocket was not a weapon, it was a blueprint. A plan made from love for people who weren't ready yet to receive love in its most demanding form, the form that requires something of you. I carry it with me still in a different way now. Not in my coat pocket, in the understanding of what it represented. The evidence that someone saw clearly and prepared carefully and trusted the future to unfold according to design. That is the inheritance I actually received. Not the house, not the accounts, not the assets that Marcus Webb's documents so carefully enumerated. The inheritance of knowing what it looks like when someone loves you, enough to plan for the worst and prepare for the best, and hold both of those truths in their hands without flinching. Richard Hargrove was a good man. He was not a perfect man. He was too absorbed in his work for too many of the years when the children were young, and he had a difficulty with confrontation that made some necessary conversations take longer than they should have. And he could be stubborn in the way of people whose confidence in their own judgment has been repeatedly validated. But he was good. He was careful. He was, in the end, exactly what he had always told me he intended to be on that first night in the diner, eating cherry pie while the October rain started against the windows and a waitress refilled our coffee for the fourth time without being asked. He built something worth staying for. He built it for me, for our children, in the way they needed, even if that way was harder than the way they wanted. He built it for the future, which is the only place any of us actually lives. Thank you for listening to me tell it. Please subscribe, share this with someone who needs it, and tell me in the comments, what did someone in your life build for you that you didn't understand until much later? I want to know. I'll read every answer.